All right, good morning, Dr. Washington. Is that the
Good
correct?
morning. Yes,
Uh, how is
Elizabeth.
these? Okay, how is the semester two kind of been going for you now? Kind of getting the ball rolling here.
Pretty good so far. I'm teaching probably my favorite class to teach, which is the role of schools in American democracy. And
Okay,
it's an online course, and I have 24 students in it, so that my enrollment's gone up year after
nice,
year from offering this course. And yeah, I'm so glad that people want to take it, and I love teaching it, and that's what I'll be doing for the rest of the semester.
beautiful. So that that blends very nicely into a lot of the topics I have down here. So when you kind of are crafting a course and kind of looking at the importance of education for democracy, like what is kind of your thinking going into teaching that course and how you structure it?
The way that I'm structuring this particular course is around the concept of the political classroom, which is
Hmm.
not my original idea. Diana
Hmm.
Hess and Paula McAvoy published a book, I think it was in 2015, called The Political Classroom. And
Hmm.
it was about different models of thinking about how you talk about important issues in a social studies classroom. What kinds of things go into that
Hmm.
discussion? If you're the teacher, what kinds of decisions do you need to make so that you can have as productive a discussion as possible? What do you want your students to understand about what it means to live in a democratic society and how to teach that to kids? So it's not exactly a civics course, it's more of a philosophy course. It's why are we doing this? Why is education
Hmm.
important in a democratic society? And how can we, if we're going to live in a democracy, we've got to be able to talk to each other. So how do we do that in a way that's positive, that's constructive?
So, what do you think are kind of the main problems teachers face in trying to engage in healthy discussion?
Wow, there's so many things that are complicated about it. I think what I hear from
Hmm.
my students more than anything is they're worried that if they have a classroom discussion, that somehow it's going to go off the rails. That students are not going to know how to engage properly in a
Hmm.
discussion, and so the teacher's worried about classroom management problems, right? Which all new teachers are certainly worried about. So there's that,
Hmm.
but then there's also, once you get past that, then there's also the substance of the issues that you're discussing. What are the different viewpoints on this particular topic that are kind of out there in the society at large? How do we talk about those in a way that makes sense? How do we talk about the kinds of topics that don't lend themselves to an easy sort of closed-ended answer? So
Hmm.
that's another thing I think to get students used to also. Most students, and I'm talking about like middle school, high school students, they're not used to
Yep.
participating in classroom discussions. So sometimes it's a
Hmm.
matter of, okay, we've got the behavior. Students know how to conduct themselves during this discussion. Now, what are we going to talk about? What are the issues, and how are we going to make sure that everybody feels included in the discussion, even if they disagree with
Hmm.
each other? And then the last thing I guess
So,
is,
sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I was just going to say the
No, I was just
last,
gonna ask. Yeah.
sure, go ahead.
No, you please go ahead there. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that the last thing that I think is important in classroom discussion is to make sure that you have built up trust in the community that you're teaching in, with your students, but also with parents, with administrators. And so, if you come across some material that's potentially controversial or thought provoking, then you've prepared your students, your parents, your administration for what you're going to be doing and why you're doing it. You've got a good
Hmm.
rationale, and that you are making good instructional decisions.
Yeah, because one of the things that I was pretty much taught in my education to be a social studies teacher was you always need to be careful about entering into bear territory. Like you need to kind of make sure that you're slowly kind of walking in, kind of being aware of your surroundings. So that was kind of the
Yes.
example you used to kind of make sure you're kind of setting up the classroom before you get there. When it
Yes.
comes to setting up the classroom, but kind of before you get into those topics, is it as simple as pretty much just like building relationships and building trust?
Yes,
Like, how does a teacher
yes,
go about doing that? Especially because you only have a semester, right, for
right.
the most part. And so how much time do you think typically it takes? And then once you kind of get that time, what do you think are the most important issues to discuss? And like, how do you kind of build toward that?
Let's see, classroom community, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the most important thing, that you've got to lay the
Mhm,
groundwork for, trusting relationships. And
mhm,
that does take a while. I would never recommend to my students that they go in on the first day of class and try to talk about something that's really controversial or
yeah,
tricky. But it takes time to show students that you care about them, that you care about what you think, that you're working on those relationships every day, that you see students for who they really are, that you know if a
mhm,
particular topic comes up, then you're sensitive to how it might impact a particular student or group of students in your classroom. So all those things I think that go into good classroom management, the building community, the development of trust, the idea that you're on the student's side, that you're there
mhm,
to help them to be able to discuss some of these issues, and that it does take time. Sometimes it takes weeks. Sometimes it can take a couple of months for students to kind of get used to you
mhm,
and to realize that you're for real, that you're authentic, that you really do care about them. And I think then you
mhm,
kind of gradually introduce students to the idea of discussion. Probably the first thing I would do is maybe something a little bit more structured, like having students do sort of a think, pair, share, where you toss
mhm,
out kind of an open-ended question and you say, okay, talk to the person next to you, and then let's all share out and talk about what we discussed with our partners. And so you gradually
mhm,
kind of move into, I think, more complex forms of discussion. And one of the things that Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy talk about in their book, The Political Classroom, is how you get students they've got to trust each other too. And that becomes a part of what you do as a teacher. But when you talk about,
mhm,
when you know that you've got to be prepared for things that students might say, things that are inappropriate that you might need to anticipate, and kind of think about those in advance too. And I
and so
forgot the
how
other
would one prepare for that?
to
I guess,
prepare
like,
for a
kinda
class.
just, like, piggybacking off what you were saying. Yeah, like, what I guess, like, let's just say you're 3 weeks in, you're getting a comfortable rapport going with your students, and then you kinda start maybe, like, trickling into some controversy, and all of a sudden, a student just absolutely lights up the room with a completely inappropriate comment. Like, how do you recommend responding in that moment?
I would say, first of all, to the student, that's not an appropriate thing to say here.
Mhm,
We're all together. We all want to trust each other. And,
mhm,
that is, what you just said could potentially be hurtful to other people
mhm,
in class. And I'm wondering if, maybe the student has blurted out something and doesn't really know what they're saying.
mhm,
So I think the first thing I would ask a student is, what do you mean by that? And how do that that's true? And not to put them on the defensive at all, but just to say,
mhm,
how do you know what you know? And, when you say, X, Y, and Z, what exactly do you mean by that? So, and then also, depending on how egregious the comment is, I would probably want to talk to the student individually and just say,
yeah.
"Hey, what were you thinking when you made that comment? Can we talk about that and why that might be kind of problematic?"
Yeah, because I've had a few instances in my own classroom where, because I really try not to shy away from getting into controversial material, and really, like, my kind of, I guess, introduction in the beginning of a semester is always, okay, the world is out there, we are in here. This is kind of like, even if you have an extremely controversial view, this is the room where we air it out.
Mhm.
Like, I kind of try to formulate that environment in the classroom. I guess, what for you is kind of the line, especially with some of the issues now, where, like, there tends to be more of a belief that you shouldn't try to emotionally trigger a student. And obviously that's not our goal, but at the same time we're also trying to help kind of raise the baseline of what does trigger them by kind of incrementally introducing them to controversial issues. So how would you kind of negotiate that balance? And how do you do it with your students now?
I think the first thing that teachers need to do is to kind of get the measure of their students. Starting from the first day of
Mhm.
class, you're asking students about themselves, just to share some things that they what they want you to know about them. And the first way that I would probably do that is just kind of anonymously, have students maybe fill out some kind of a
Mhm.
questionnaire to say, what kinds of things are you interested in? What are you concerned about? And I would also want to get at students talking about, who are you in terms of your identity? How do you see yourself? And
Mhm.
where do you see kind of your role as a student or as just a citizen? What kinds of things concern you as a future citizen? And when I can find out things like that from students, just kind of one on one, finding out who they are, finding out something about their families, finding out something about what their interests are, what are their personalities like, and then that gives me a lot of
Mhm.
information to go forward and the kinds of things that I want to talk about and the kinds of things that I might be concerned that a student might blurt out. For example, um,
Yeah.
one time when I was teaching, I had a student who blurted out something derogatory about gay people. And so I talked with the student, the first thing I said was, that's not an appropriate thing to say. We don't use that kind of language here. And then we
Mhm.
talked after class so that I could sort of get more of a sense of where he was coming from. And I talked to his parents as well, just to say, this is the discussion, this is what happened. And I just, wanted you to know. And then let the parents sort of take it from there. But it's very difficult, and it really depends on the issue that you're talking about. So I think before you talk about any controversial issue, you've got to know who your students are and where their kind of sensitive points might be, and that's based
Mhm.
on information that they've given you, not necessarily that they've shared with the rest of the class. Does that make sense?
100%, yeah, 'cause I've even kind of noticed myself, if you have your kind of traditional, not traditional students, but when you have students in your classroom who are more likely to be engaged on, like, an everyday basis, but then when controversial stuff comes up, like, you kinda just notice them shut down. So that's when I kind of read the room of, like, do I flip what I'm doing? Do I kind of just move on to a different thing and come back to this later? I find usually when you have your students who are typically engaged that kind of end up shutting down. That's kind of been my measure, I guess, in a sense of saying, like, how far into this controversy are we going to go? Um, I would say that's
Yes.
kind of because I guess my question would be, we understand that social studies is at its core trying to think critically and engage with controversial issues in order to have healthier discussions as a society. So when you kind of bring students into your own classroom, like, I guess my challenge with controversial issues so far has been trying to get even more nuanced with the discussion because let's just say, for example, um, in my classroom, we do like a big controversial issues project. So the way that I typically frame it is kind of modeled after a project I did in university as well, where up in Canada, we have like the question period of like the official opposition and like the prime minister. And basically, the way it goes is that you could pretty much piggyback off of the person who you just spoke across from, but you don't necessarily have to answer or respond to that specific point. It's
Mhm.
almost like trying to put it into a mass debate structure,
Yeah.
and the students don't know what side they're arguing until the day of, so
Hmm.
they have to equally prepare for both sides. And I think when you get to that level and the students have chosen their topic and they've had a week to kind of do the research, do the like molding of the presentation, and then present and do an individual reflective essay after of kind of how their mind changed or did not. I think that part kind of like, do you have any advice for even that project or like how you could even have the students encourage them to go deeper on that? Or is it a bit more self-evident than I'm thinking?
I think that the way that I encourage students to go deeper into a discussion is it's kind of like really what you're talking about. It's not so different. There's a version of that that I think is probably kind of similar to what you're talking about. And again, this is not my original idea either, but it's
Mhm.
called structured academic controversy. And so you put students into small groups of four, and you
Mhm.
give them a particular issue to research, and you give them some sources that you've kind of picked out. And in other words, don't let students just go on a wild goose chase when they don't necessarily know what they're looking for, but give them some high quality
Mhm.
sources to look through, have them do the research, give them some specific guiding questions to do as they do the research. Here are some things that I want you to be looking for. And then in the group of four, let's say your issue is climate change and
Mhm.
whether that's caused by human activity or not. I don't consider that particularly controversial, but in a lot of classrooms, it
Mhm.
still is. And so
Mhm.
you have two students who are taking the yes side and two students who are taking the no side. And then when they've done their research, they have to be able to explain their side to the other side and to say, here's why we believe what we do, and here are the reasons, here are our research findings. And so then the other side is supposed to ask them questions about what they found. And then after you've gone through a cycle of that, you have students switch sides. And then whoever was doing the yes, then they have to make the argument for the other side and say, okay, here's why I know you were arguing against this. Here are what I understand you to say to be your reasons for this. And here are your sources of information. And so when students can kind of talk to each other like that and show each other that they're pretty clear on their understanding of what the others are saying, then I think
Mhm.
that's a really good place to get to into a discussion. Nobody has to quote unquote win. Nobody has to
Mhm.
beat the other side, but it's a matter of understanding, kind of like what you're saying. You want students to have a deeper understanding of the issues, not necessarily because they're trying to to be on the debate team, but because you just want
Yeah.
them to understand the issues better and to be able to understand both sides. Or sometimes there are more
Yeah.
than two sides. Sometimes there may be three or four sides,
Yeah.
but to be able to understand those by talking with each other after having done the research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, that's pretty much like a smaller scale. And honestly, the more that we're talking about it, I'm even thinking maybe the group of six is a little bit too big. Maybe the group of four would be a bit more. That way, in the other sense, when you have groups of four, you could actually get more conversations discussed as a presentation. So the students who are even listening and not doing that project can be
Yes.
exposed to more as well. I've noticed a common thread in your research as well as I've been kind of going through, I guess, the preparation for this is that you really hone in on the word citizen and citizenship. How has your, like, I guess to me, for social studies in here in Alberta, like citizenship is kind of the main goal. But I guess I've always, again, maybe assumed that was more kind of self evident, as that's just kind of what we're trying to do. But I guess how would you kind of reframe what that means? And like how does that apply to how we teach?
What it means to be a citizen or to learn about being a citizen?
Well, because I know that you were looking at like redefining what the word citizen means.
Yes. When we talk about the idea of citizenship, we have to go back to,
Mhm.
we're talking about democratic citizenship. And so
Mhm.
we have to go back to the starting point, I think, for me, is going back to the work of John Dewey. I would not have my students read John Dewey. It's very dense, and
Yeah.
it takes a long time. But the main idea is democracy is a way of life. It's a way of living with other people. It's a way of being with other people, a way of talking with other people. And to be a citizen in a democratic society means that not only do you understand what your responsibilities are and what your rights are, but it also means that you know how to treat other people as worthwhile, members of society who are worth listening to. And so when you think about being a citizen in a democratic society, it's of course it's about the basic things that we want all citizens to be able to do, to be able to vote, to participate, but it's so much more than that. And if you want students to be good citizens, then you kind of have to model that yourself as the teacher in the classroom, and to talk about what that means in the context of a democracy. And by that, and when you do that, I think you can compare what it means to be a citizen in other kinds of forms of government, and why being a citizen in a democracy is different, why it's unique. And I think to talk about that in a social studies classroom from day one, um, whatever subject you're teaching, is really important.
Interesting. So looking at kind of, I guess maybe a small scale scenario here. And I don't know if you would have an answer for this, but I guess how would it be different being a citizen in Canada versus the United States? Like, how would you kind of go about that discussion? Just like a quick
Um,
thought experiment, if you
yeah.
will.
Well, I would start off by saying, first of all, these are self-proclaimed democratic societies. Okay, what
Mhm,
does that mean? If you live in a democratic society, you expect to have certain rights, certain
mhm,
freedoms, as well as certain responsibilities. Okay, so let's look at what those are essentially in the U.S., and let's look at what they are in Canada, and how do those compare? I would want students to understand, first of all, what is the Canadian Constitution? Does Canada have something like a Bill of Rights, like we have in the U.S.? How
yeah,
do we compare the forms of
yeah, like a
government?
charter of
How
rights and
does
freedoms. Yeah.
Right, right, exactly. And in terms of the structure of government, a parliamentary system versus the federalist system that we have here, and what what do we need to understand about the different branches of government, but especially about the kinds of rights and freedoms that we have. So I think in doing that, we would certainly find a lot of similarities, in terms of the kinds of freedoms that people can expect in both societies. But also, we want to look
Mhm,
at kind of how that plays out in reality. What does the government protect those freedoms in reality? Is it something that we just sort of talk about, but we don't really necessarily extend those freedoms to everyone? How do those kinds of
mhm.
things compare in the US and Canada? Um, I've spent a lot of time in Canada because my son goes to school there, and I think
Mhm.
there are some great things that Canadian democracy has to offer to teach American democracy, especially now in these times that are so polarized. I wonder if there are some things that Americans can learn from Canadians about how to communicate better, how to understand how
So
to
you
talk
think
to
that's a common is that kind of like more of a common perception of Canada as being just like a more level discourse?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And
I
so if you don't mind me asking, because
In this country it is, yes.
one of okay. And one of my own kind of wonderings, because obviously I was fully educated in both Edmonton and Calgary and Alberta here. Why the decision for your son to go to Canada for university? I'm just curious.
He had been living in Florida all his life, and wanted
Mhm.
to, experience something very different. I think, different kinds of people, different kinds of political viewpoints, I think more, academic freedom, than we're having some issues with that
Really?
right now, I think, in US schools and universities. And so I think he was interested in that, but also I think he wanted to go to school just somewhere outside the United States to have a
Yeah.
different experience. I
Okay.
think he would like to live and work outside the United States. And so I think
Well,
that's
I'm actually oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm very intrigued in the way where you said that it's like more academic freedom in Canada because I guess the common narrative to me has been Canada has regressed in terms of its commitment to academic freedom, whereas the United States is kind of framed as this safe haven of free speech. So I know some of the things that you also talk about as well is like faculty activism in
Mhm.
kind of the university. How has the faculty changed in your time as a professor?
Um,
And maybe I'm phrasing the question wrong. Like, are you referring to like faculty activism in terms of promoting other things, or in terms of or trying to defend itself?
Well, let me back up just for just a minute to what
Absolutely.
you were saying about academic freedom. Yes, the United States has had a great reputation for that for a long time, but that's changing. And this has to do with laws that are being passed in many states. I think at least a third of
Mhm.
the states have something on their books right now about what you can and can't talk about in terms of race, in terms of LGBTQ issues. You know, that's true in a public school classroom, that's true in a college classroom. I think there are a lot of faculty and a lot of teachers who are feeling very anxious right now about what they can and can't say in the classroom because they're afraid that it's going to be against the law. And that's very real. That's happening in Florida. Florida has been on the leading edge of that in the laws that have been passed restricting academic freedom and academic discourse. So that's a real struggle right now that I think a lot of us are feeling very apprehensive about and unsure about because we don't necessarily know what these laws mean. They're not necessarily very specific. And I think that's probably kind of the purpose, is just, kind of making people
Mhm.
feel nervous and afraid to speak up. So, in terms
Mhm.
of what you're asking about faculty, I don't see a lot of my colleagues as quote unquote activists. It depends on, it depends on what you mean by activism, I guess.
Mhm.
I consider myself an activist for social studies. And by that, I
Mhm.
mean, I talk with people like you. I've been on other podcasts,
Mhm.
I've done webinars,
Mhm.
public lectures, just kind of talking to people, about, different kinds of issues that the public would be interested
Mhm.
in. But that's the extent of what I think a lot of faculty's
Mhm.
activism goes. It's
Mhm.
advocating for your field of study and why
Mhm.
it's important, why it matters. I don't have a lot of colleagues who I think, go out and are active in a lot of organizations, getting involved in a lot of political organizations and that sort of thing. I don't think that's the kind of activism that faculty engage in. I think it's activism on behalf of your profession and making sure that
Mhm.
you stand up for it, that you help other people understand why social studies is important and why students need to have certain experiences in the social studies classroom that they're not going to have in other classes. In terms of how the faculty is changing, I think the most glaring, probably the most glaring change in my college is just the growth of educational technology and AI. A lot of the hiring that we're doing now is in those fields. And so I see we still do teacher education, yes, but I think there's so much more interest now in educational technology. That's where the money's going. Artificial intelligence, that's where the money's going. And so we're hiring a lot more faculty who have those kinds of skills and expertise.
Mhm. And to kind of go back to one of your previous points there, because one of the questions I kind of had for you, because I know obviously you'd be very well versed in this, is like what challenges do social studies teachers face that teachers in other disciplines do not? 'Cause I do think I don't know if I'm wording the question wrong, because I've asked some people about it, and maybe I'm not necessarily summarizing my experience well enough. I do find there's a general opposition to the just existence of social studies mattering in general. I do kind of get that, like, "Oh, like, Mr. Clark, why are we doing this? Like, this is stupid, like, this doesn't make any sense." And obviously, your most formal defense is, "Well, this is the curriculum. This is what the province is asking me to carry out and teach you." But how would you respond to, like, why does social studies matter? Like, how do you defend that? Like, what's kind of your summary of that?
It depends on who I'm talking to. Um,
Okay.
if I'm talking to people who are going to be teaching elementary school, for example, that's a whole
Mhm.
different conversation about why social studies matters than if I'm talking to people who are going to teach high school, for example. I don't
Mhm.
know about Canada, but in the United States, social studies at the elementary school is almost non-existent. And it's because of the massive standardized testing that we've had for going back for decades, where reading is tested, math is tested, but nobody really cares about testing social studies, and it's not even mentioned in some of the curriculum reform movements that we've seen, like A Nation at Risk and Goals 2000 and things like that that we've had in the U.S. that have tried to make the U.S. more competitive in terms of the education system. Um, so it seems to me that if I'm talking to an elementary audience, then what I have to emphasize is that social studies is a good way to get your kids to read. And if we use social studies, if we use the substance of social studies to teach English and language arts, then we can have both. So that's a conversation that I've had with many students and with principals. You know, if you want social studies to be taught in the elementary school, put it in there with English and language arts, and then we'll see how it's more important and how useful it is. Now, you know, with older students, you know, I try to tell them that that what they're learning, the the knowledge that comes from social studies, is the kind of knowledge that will help them to to get along with other people, to understand our history and why we are who we are, to understand maybe some of the successes that we've had as a people, some of the failures that we've had, things that we're still trying to work on. We can't understand any of those things unless we talk about our history, unless we talk about government, even geography, you know, economics, of course. We need to understand all of those things if we're going to understand who we are as a people, understand ourselves better, understand other people, the people that we're living with every day, and to understand kind of what's happened to us as a country. If we're a democracy, you know, that's great. If we've got a constitution, great. How successful are we at living up to the goals and ideals that we've spelled out? And so I think that's where social studies is the most useful. When we founded this country, we said these are the things that matter, these are the things that we want to do, and these are the things that we believe in. So how are we doing on those things now? Let's kind of
Mhm.
take stock, and get students to talk about those things and how things might have been different in the past, what kinds of things have caused them to be issues now that affect so many people, and to really understand why I don't know a good way to say it. Why, you know, why do we live the way that we do? And
Mhm.
social studies provides a lot of answers to that. Whether it's from studying our history or our economy or our government, we understand ourselves better when we know what kinds of things are in the different social studies disciplines that we have to teach us.
Yeah, I almost find it like laughable in the sense that a lack of social awareness can be considered more competitive. And I know obviously I'm biased here being a social studies teacher myself. And I always kind of reframe, I always kind of try to joke with the students when they bring that up. I'll say, well, the founding fathers weren't arguing about mathematics. Like, that's not the thing that they were really discussing in terms of how you run a society. So, and there's another quote. It was John Green in a crash course video. I know, a classic secondary social teacher move, where we were watching it. He said, education is like insurance for your rights.
Mm,
But that's like one thing that I've absolutely honed in on. It's like, I think most of the things that we teach in social in a democratic society are taken for granted because the kids only know what it is to live in the democratic society. So it does
right.
kind of make you be a bit more cyclical. And I'm like, well, this is why you can just go do what you want after school. This is why you have the choice to not go into the military. Paul, what's the word? Like, you're not. It's not mandatory for you to enter the military as soon as you turn 18 and serve your
Mhm.
country. Like, you have the choice. I do think that is lost on a lot of students, and I guess like maybe that is our job to then instill and try to promote. Um, yeah, and
Yeah, and
I did
also,
not know. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
and also I was going to say, you know, and I'm sure that you know this very well from your experience as a teacher. When you're enthusiastic and excited about something, students probably will be too. Not every day, not
No.
necessarily in in the ways that we all
And
in the ways that we all. Sometimes they're not in the mood, and you know we
yeah.
understand that. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's one of the things that we talk about with my pre-service teachers all the time is, you're in this program to become a teacher because you love history. Great.
Mm.
Why do you love history, and why should your students love history? So let's talk about that. Don't assume that they will. Don't assume that they're going to get excited about it. But if you are, that improves your chances.
Yeah.
And if you kind of think of yourself as a performer in a way, then sometimes that will get
Yeah.
students kind of wrapped into what you're doing.
Yeah. That can be
Um,
weirdly exhausting in its own way, trying to
yeah,
put on the performance all the time, but I think
it's
that's
very
any
exhausting.
engagement anywhere. That's any and one of the things I always ask, like, a lot of the teachers that I have on, like, "How do you keep your energy up?" Because obviously mine is right here in this mug that helps me get through the day,
Yeah.
but I do think so again, this is a kind of a sidestep here. With your students, how much are you kind of maybe talking about that balance between, like, project-based and lecturing in your classroom? Like, how do you kind of
We
balance
talk
I guess one of the things I came across is, like, the pedagogical negotiation a little bit, but
Yes, we talk about that a lot, and I think that a lot of my students, my pre-service teacher students, have a lot of experience with being lectured to,
mhm,
whether
yeah,
it's in a high school classroom, but especially in college classrooms. And so sometimes they may come into the program thinking that that's the way to teach. And so we have to talk about, yes, there has to be more of a balance. There are times when, yes, you want to lecture because students need some background information on a particular topic. And before
mhm,
they can do a project, they need to have some information, to talk about.
something to go off
Um,
of, yeah,
it's something to go off of. Exactly. And so we talk about, if you're going to do lecture, try to keep it pretty succinct, 15, 20 minutes, just kind of cover some key points. And maybe don't use the textbook. If you can use your own outside sources, that's
mhm,
best. And then when you give students opportunities to do projects, they have so many choices. I like the idea of students doing formative assessment instead of just taking a test at the end of every unit of study that they do. And so, if my students are, for example, doing a unit of study on the Vietnam War, there might be some lecture involved in that because my students are going to need to know some of the background of how we got involved there in the
mhm,
first place. But then, as a way of wrapping up the unit, I might give them 7 or 8 choices of projects that they can do at the end of the unit to demonstrate what they've learned. And for some students, that might be a paper that they write. Some students like to write papers, and that's what they want to do. Others might want to do something with music and poetry, with photography, with kind of a newscast. There are all different kinds of options there. I think for students being able to show what they've learned after a particular unit of study. And so that's sort of at the the higher level of assessing students when they've studied a particular topic. On a day-to-day basis, I try to suggest to students that they have, in a 50-minute class period, that they have at least 2 different activities that they're gonna have students do, and one of those might be a short lecture, one of those might be a cooperative learning activity, where they've got to come up with something to present to the rest of the class after they had a chance to talk to each other. So I like to balance those both within a single class period and then over the course of time within a unit of study. I think you
mm,
can do both, and you need to do both.
absolutely, and that kind of goes into my obviously, we that's and every teacher, I think, is going to find their own variation of that. I do think that's one of the areas where, like, there kind of is no perfect answer, but I do think your kind of 20-25 minute rule is very accurate, and then kind of how you should go about shaking up your class as you go. Because we have 90-minute blocks where I'm teaching, so that can be a very long time, and I'm really appreciating your cat right there in the background. I'm absolutely loving it.
She likes to be
As
on
it's
camera.
It's bringing me back to my, university on Zoom days, but, yeah, when it comes I know you've had a lot of experience because what you just said about there not being social studies present in the elementary schools in some contexts is just crazy to me because it is very much there's a K through 12 program here. We have standardized assessment for social studies, grade 10, 11, and or sorry, just grade 12 here in Alberta, then grade 10, 11 kind of shape how we prepare them for grade 12, if you will. But in your experience writing curriculum, I know even right now, Alberta's in the middle. I think we actually get like our scope and sequence of our new high school curriculum coming out here in the next week or so. If you had to pretty much, I know context is important, but kind of outside of the maybe writing for Alberta or writing for Florida, what do you think are some of the things that when you are in high school, in terms of topics or content, that you think should be universally required?
And do you mean in a history class or just kind of in
It just in a
general? Or
social studies classroom.
I'm not sure I totally understand your question. Do you mean like the content or the kinds of things that the activities that students are doing or
I think more so the
all of the
content. Like
above?
I only say because a friend of mine and myself went to like Tucker Carlson came to Alberta recently. So we were down in Edmonton. So we went to the just to kind of scout the crowd, kind of see what the environment was like. And I found it really funny because as he was talking once, he was kind of going down this tangent of like the left wing taking over the schools, et cetera, kind of like just typical kind of conservative rhetoric. And then he's like, the things that kids should be learning in school are like the French Revolution and like the Russian Revolution and the Cold War,
Mm,
which was literally our curriculum, which I thought
right,
that was kind of funny. Like I don't know, obviously maybe he probably didn't read our grade 12 curriculum before he got here, but
probably not.
I just thought it was funny that like I guess the attitude of what actually happens in social studies classrooms is actually not necessarily the norm. But I guess
Mhm.
maybe when I'm thinking about topics that should be mandatory, I'm thinking like should the Russian Revolution be taught to everyone, or should the American Revolution be taught to everyone? Like, are there certain things that you think are just like non-negotiables if you had to form any curriculum anywhere?
Um, if yes, if I'm doing, I'll use world history as an example because I taught
Mhm,
that for several years. Um, I want my students to understand the history of revolutionary movements and not necessarily that we're all violent, but
mhm,
what were these movements that changed things for so many people in different parts of the world? What kinds of if it was a revolutionary movement in terms of a war, why did it happen? What did it accomplish? If it's a movement for change like the anti-apartheid movement, how did that happen? And what has been the result of moving
mhm,
past
mhm.
that kind of form of government? So that's probably the one of the things that I want my students to understand most in a history classroom. When people have wanted to bring about change, what have they done? I think that goes for a history class. I think that goes
It's a
for a
great
government
through line.
yeah, for an economics class. We're talking about change, how people change, why people change, what they want, how they get what they want,
Mhm,
and how they treat other people in the process of getting what they want.
mhm.
And so that's a huge thing, I think, for me thematically. And also, I think it's important to study the history of how people got their rights. And by this, I don't mean just civil rights. Obviously, those are really important. But when we talk about the idea of human rights, what does that mean? That's not just an American concept. That's not just a Canadian concept. What do we mean by human rights around the world? And how have people been able to fight for and achieve the human rights that they are entitled to because they were born with them? So that's another important theme that I think I would want to touch on, no matter what social studies content I was teaching.
Beautiful. All right, so I only got a couple more things to ask you, and it kind of piggybacks off of your kind of theme there. When I was kind of gone through my, I guess, my training, if you will, it was one of the kind of ways to reframe the curriculum, regardless of where you're teaching. So let's just say I get a grade 12 job in Florida versus Alberta. The curriculums are obviously going to be different, but in terms of how you address the curriculum, one of the kind of tools I guess I was taught was the idea of the through line question, of just kind of the way you kind of embed the content through a consistent reflection on like a common theme.
Yes.
One of the things that we've touched on in my grade 12 class, because we talk about liberalism and ideology, is like how has our relationship with freedom changed over time? So it's like classical modern liberalism. I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that. But I guess, do you have any sort of tools that you kind of communicate to your pre-service students similar to the through line, that you kind of, the way that you engage with the content?
Yes, there are a couple of things, and I don't claim to be good at these things, but one of the things that I like to talk about is, backwards design. Is that
Mhm.
something you're familiar with? It's
Absolutely. It's my
yeah,
my life.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and so we talk about that, as a way of kind of starting off like, okay, where do I want to get to? By the time I finish
Mhm.
teaching this particular topic, but also, I guess the through line, I guess in what I do, I call that the guiding question, and I
Mhm.
have that I ask students to do one of those for every single lesson plan that they write. What is your guiding question for this lesson plan? What do you want
Mhm.
students to be able to know or to understand by the end of this lesson? And how do you want them to show that they understand? It could be as simple as using an index card to write a couple of thoughts about what they take away from the lesson, um, an exit ticket, if you will. So, yes, I think the idea of the guiding question is the main thing that I do when students are doing lesson plans or unit plans. And this goes beyond just specific goals and objectives, but like what's your big picture question? And that's what I
Mhm.
have students think about first before they start writing about activities and assessments and those kinds of things. What do you want to accomplish in this lesson? What's your big question that you want students to be able to answer?
Beautiful. I guess one more side question here is one of the things, and honestly, one of the main reasons why I tried to start doing this podcast and talking to people like yourself is one of the things that I thought was underrated going into teaching is the content's only a part of your job, whereas when you're kind of in your practicum, it's everything to you. Is just kind of mastering that content. How would you kind of recommend teachers? Obviously, I know you can do a master's degree and go on that, but even as you're moving throughout your year, how would you advise people to like engage in quality professional learning for social studies? Do you have some examples of things that you found very helpful that are kind of like long form, or even readings or articles that really kind of stand out to you, as kind of shorter snippets of information people can use to kind of help hone their practice?
Yeah, absolutely. For social studies teachers, the first thing I tell them is you have a professional home. You have the National Council for the Social Studies. And so when you join that, you're going to have all kinds of resources coming your way. And that can mean, magazines, journals that they publish that'll give you some really specific ideas about lesson plans, but also professional learning activities like seminars, webinars, workshops that you can go to, things that are free,
Mhm.
and you just need to find out about them. And so if you join NCSS, then you will find out about a lot of those things. But then also there are other organizations, other nonprofits like Learning for Justice, like Facing History. Those kinds of educational organizations produce really good resources, and they also have really good learning experiences for teachers. Like, they'll bring you in for a workshop over a long weekend or something in the summer. And so I try to recommend to my students that first of all, they join their professional organization, and second, they start looking through different organizations to find out what kinds of professional development opportunities are being offered. Um, and with I think the reason that I mention NCSS so much is not because I get any kind of a kickback. I don't. But I tell people that this is where you're going to find the most practical resources. Um, for, if you need some
Okay.
ideas for your classroom, then this is going to be a good resource for you. But also, um, having recommending to students that they take more courses in their subject area, if they have the opportunity to do that, to take some graduate classes in history or economics, something that'll give them some richer content knowledge than they might have gotten as an undergraduate student. So I want students to look at both of those things. What is going to make you a better content expert, and what's going to make you a better pedagogy expert? And you have two different kinds of opportunities where you can learn about both of those things, and then how those things come together in bringing your content knowledge and your pedagogy knowledge together so that you can translate what you know into forms that students will understand.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I got one more thing to ask you, Elizabeth.
Sure.
I always end off the podcast asking your perspective on a quote and kind of how you relay this to your students. But the quote is, education is what remains once we forget everything that we learned in school. What is it that you want your students to take away from their time with you in your classroom that they won't get with anyone else? Some people have said, like, don't be afraid to learn, don't be like, know that we're caring for you, etc.
I think that what students may not necessarily get in all of their education classes is about the importance of relationships. My students take classes to learn about teaching methods. They learn about how to teach reading. They learn about data-driven instruction, all those things that are really important. But where in your program are you learning about relationships and what it means when you have students whose lives are struggling, that they're struggling so much that when they come into your classroom, there's a lot there that you need to understand about that student. And so I think that's something that I can do to prepare my students more than a lot of other things I think that are very important. You've got to understand the kids that you're teaching and to build relationships, to know that this student may be going through such a hard time. Maybe your class is the only time in that child's day when somebody treats them well, when somebody treats them with respect, when somebody gives them something meaningful to do and
Mhm.
something meaningful, something substantive to learn. That's depressing to think about, that some kids' lives are that way, but they are. And so when you think of, if you can think of each student as having their own individual unique needs, and you're doing everything that you can to find out what those are, then that's going to help you really, that's going to make the difference in whether you're a good teacher or a really great teacher that students really can relate to and will remember for the rest of their lives.
Beautiful. Couldn't have said any better myself. Thank you very much for coming on today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure. Nice meeting